Welcome to St. Jerome's University, and welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Scott Klein, and I'm the director of the center. It's wonderful to see so many people out this evening. It's been a wonderful year in terms of trying to pull off these events, and with all the weather and all of the different things that happen around a university, it's actually a good thing that we can hold one of these events on a Friday evening, so many obstacles and so on. This year is a special year in the history of the center, and I'd like to work you through some of this to give you some context for our speaker this evening. As many of you know, this is the 25th anniversary of the center, and when it was created in 1982, it was, I'll show you some slides and some pictures. It was envisioned as a place where people could come together and talk about issues that mattered, faith and justice. In particular, some of you have actually seen this slide. It comes from the work of one Dr. Michael Higgins, the former president of St. Jerome's University. This is actually Michael's artistic work. And there's Michael with hair and so on. Michael said this about the center when it was created in 1982. It was the vision here at St. Jerome's. The center is broadly based ecumenical effort deeply rooted in the Catholic tradition and concerned with issues of spirituality and justice. And I think this vision is one that we've kept over the last 25 years. In fact, we've cherished it. So every director since Michael, including a number of former directors that are here this evening, including Doug Letson, who is also the former president of St. Jerome's, and dean and chief bottle washer and janitor, everything. And Megan Shore is the former director as well, so she's here. And we always understood that we had a trust. That we were always going to focus on issues of spirituality, issues of faith, and social justice. What did we do in that first year, 82, 83? We brought in a number of speakers, people who pushed us, people who challenged us. This is a picture of Gregory Baum in 1983. And one of the things that I saw, one of the themes that I continually saw going back through the brochures, is that you had this understanding that we were going to talk about things that matter, issues that matter, social justice, poverty, the environment, women's issues, what it means to be a Canadian, what it means to be a citizen in a modern world. These were some of the major issues that came about even in the early years. To that, we had people like Ernesto Cardenal, one of the leading liberation theologians, coming and talking to us about this emerging sort of political theology in Latin America, and again, was very much a challenge to a number of us. Over the years, we've had people challenge us in regard to what it means to be a global citizen. We had people like Gerard Peltier, who was here in 1990. Many of you know he was a member of Parliament and a journalist, editor of Montreal newspaper, spoke here in 1990. I'm not trying to put the pressure on you, but it's a pretty good line. We also had Claude Ryan here in 2000. This is a picture of David Seljak, who sends his regards. He's up in Collingwood giving a series of lectures tonight. He'll be skiing tomorrow, but he sends his regards. Claude was here for a series of events around Catholics and public life, and also gave the John J. Wintermeyer lecture on Christianity and public policy at the center. So we've also had lecturers challenge us to develop community, solidarity with people who are on the margins of society. Sister Helen Prejean was here in 1998 to talk about issues around death penalty in the United States and looking at the dignity of the human person and people who are marginalized because they've committed crimes, and the justice system saying that these people are in some sense not human any longer. Well, Sister Prejean, as many of you know, says that no, these people are still human. They've committed great injustices, but there's still something in them. They're still God's creatures. So we had Jean Vanier here in 2001, again, challenging us to develop community and solidarity with people who are on the margins of society. So I think what you're seeing here is that we've had people who have leaders, Canadians who have led us, challenged us to think about our faith, to put our faith into action. And again, this understanding of what the center is supposed to be about goes back to its origins. So what are we going to do in the next few years? Well, I think we're in some sense going to move forward. We're going to move forward with the help of our lecture partners. This evening we have the Loretto sisters with us who are sponsoring this evening's lecture by Madame Frechette, the Teresa Deese lecture, also the John J. Wintermeyer lecture in public policy, the Sweeney lecture in current issues in healthcare, which is coming up in March, and you can read some of the rest. Also very important to us in making sure that we go forward with this trust is just our community, the people who are continually with us and who help make this center very much a reality. So we look forward to working with you over the next 25 years to promote a socially engaged faith and to work toward a more just world. And I really invite you to partner with us as we move forward into, I guess, the next 25 years. So at some point in my life when I'm nearing retirement, hopefully somebody will be showing a picture of me when I have hair that's still relatively dark, although it's turning gray, and we can look back and hopefully this will be something that we can again cherish. This leads us to this evening's lecture and providing some context. I got the sense, though, looking at this, is that we only invite liberals to speak. That's not true. Just now dawned on me. Didn't mean to. Well, Cardinal and Baum are not liberals, by the way. We have had Preston Manning speak here and a number of other public people who are in public life. This evening's lecture by Madame Frechette is the Teresa Deese lecture, sponsored by the Loretto sisters. If you don't know anything about the Loretto sisters, there is one thing that you should definitely know. These sisters are committed to social justice, going back to their founder, Mary Ward, who founded the order in 1609, I believe that's right, and was very much a part of a commitment to social justice. A number of leaders within the order, including Teresa Deese, who was the superior in the late 19th century, always were advocating for people who were on the margins of society. So it is a wonderful partnership that we've established with the Loretto sisters and look forward to future endeavors. This evening's speaker is going to be introduced not by me, but by Mr. Harry Froelich, our Director of Development and Graduate Studies at St. Jerome's University. I would invite Harry to come forward at this point. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a special good evening to the students and supporters of St. Jerome's who join us tonight. This evening's talk on the subject of empowering women, a sound investment, will shortly be delivered by a woman who was, in 2004 and 2005, identified by Forbes magazine as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world, along with Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and the ubiquitous Oprah Winfrey. It must be wonderful to be a walking, talking, visual aid for the subject that you are about to address. It's not an experience I personally have ever had, but Madame Frechette certainly stands as an exemplar of the topic she's about to explore with us. As a graduate of Collège Basile Moreau and the Université de Montréal, Madame Frechette holds a postgraduate diploma in economic studies at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. She joined the Canadian government as a foreign service officer and went on to serve as Associate Deputy Minister in the Department of Finance. From 1992 to 1995, Madame Frechette was the permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations, and from 1995 to 1998, she was the Deputy Minister of National Defence of Canada. In 1997, the General Assembly of the United Nations created the post of Deputy Secretary General to assist the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan. It was for this role that Forbes chose to address or recognize tonight's speaker. She managed the operations of the Secretariat and worked closely with the Secretary General in all areas to ensure coherence in activities and programs. Among her specific responsibilities were the elevation of the United Nations profile and leadership in the economic and social spheres. She chaired the Steering Committee on Reform and Management Policy and the Advisory Board of the United Nations Fund for International Partnerships, which handles relations with the foundation set up by Ted Turner in support of the United Nations. Upon stepping down from the Deputy Secretary General's post in March 2006, she returned to Canada and in particular to Waterloo, where she is currently a Distinguished Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we like to know it in town. In recognition of her accomplishments, she has received honorary doctoral degrees from the University of Waterloo, the folks across the creek, St. Mary's University in Halifax, Kyung Hee University in Seoul, the University of Ottawa, the University of Toronto, Laval University, Université de Montréal, Carleton University, Queen's University, and the University of Turin. In 1998, she was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada. Canadians have always had a special sense of affinity and connection with the United Nations. The early contributions of Lester Pearson, our military's proud role as peacekeepers, and our continual hope that the United Nations would accomplish its lofty mandate in the service of mankind amount almost to a defining characteristic of the Canadian identity. Certainly the knowledge that Madame Frechette, a Canadian, had been selected as the first Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations was a source of special, albeit quiet, pride for all Canadians. It is therefore a great honor and a pleasure to have her here this evening to deliver the 2007 and 8 Theresa Dees Lecture on the subject of empowering women, a sound investment. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an empowered person, Louise Frechette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferkage, for this very generous introduction. And let me tell you that I'm greatly honored to be invited to speak after all these extraordinary people who preceded me in this very spot. Actually, when I saw the name of Jean Vanier appear on the screen, I nearly walked out. I really, I don't think I can match in any way this extraordinary man. I've been asked to talk about women empowerment. Well, I'm going to start by saying that I'm a very lucky woman. I grew up at a time of profound transformation in the life of women in Canada. My generation is the first one to have broken in significant numbers the barriers that prevented women from occupying positions of authority in most professions as well as in government. We were, of course, preceded by many brave and talented women who, in the first half of the 20th century, fought for access to positions traditionally reserved for men. I'm thinking of Carrie Derrick, who was the first woman in Canada to become a full university professor. That happened at McGill University in 1912. I'm thinking of Roberta McAdams and Louise McKinney, who were the first women elected to the Alberta legislature in 1917. Incidentally, we all know, I think, that the first province to grant women the right to vote was Manitoba in 1916, followed very closely by Ontario in 1917. But Quebec, my own province, did not do so until, get that, 1940. Nothing to be proud of. I'm thinking here of Agnes MacPhail, who was the first woman elected to the House of Commons. That was in 1921. And of Karen Wilson, the first woman appointed to the Senate in 1930. Now, you'll note that the electors were a lot quicker than the government to realize that women belong in positions of power in politics. Not new. We see that often. I'm thinking of Ellen Ferklow, the first woman minister in the federal cabinet. She was appointed Minister of Citizenship and Immigration by Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in 1957. In my own chosen profession, diplomacy, there were also trailblazers. In the 1950s, a few of them, Margaret Marr, Pamela McDougall, finally achieved the rank of ambassador after modest beginnings in the Department of External Affairs. I say modest beginnings because women could not be recruited in the professional ranks of the Foreign Service until after the Second World War. Until then, they could join only as clerks or secretaries, no matter how many university degrees they held. These women were true pioneers. They often were the sole representative of their gender in universes that continued to be dominated by men. They carried a double burden. Of their success or failure depended not only their own reputation, but that of all women. So yes, there were many individual cases of successful women throughout Canadian history. But it is only in the decade of the 60s that the cause of women's equality gathered steam, under the impetus of strong, vocal women's groups that suddenly appeared in many Western countries and particularly in the United States. The women's liberation movement is often remembered for its colorful leaders, like Bella Abzug and her many hats, and for spectacular episodes of public bra burning. But Women's Lib, as it was called, was in fact a deadly serious affair. Under pressure from these groups, governments started to focus on issues of concern to women. In Canada, Prime Minister Lester Pearson set up the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1967. Its recommendations came out three years later and touched on a host of issues, from maternity leave and birth control to the issue of equal pay for work of equal value. The Commission's guiding principle was that women should be free to choose the life that they wanted. In the ensuing years, the government moved to entrench women's rights in law and amended its own practices. All this may seem trite to women in 2008, who have been enjoying these rights as a matter of course, but these notions could not be taken for granted at the time, believe me. The drive towards women's equality soon became a global preoccupation. 1975 was proclaimed International Women's Year, and the first UN Conference on Women was convened in Mexico. This conference would be followed by 3 more, in Copenhagen in 1980, Nairobi in 1985, and Beijing in 1995. The great merit of these conferences was to set common standards, common goals against which governments' performances could be measured. Women's groups around the world used agreements which their government had publicly endorsed at these conferences to pressure them to live up to their commitment and take measures to eliminate discriminatory practices in their own country. A minister responsible for the status of women in a Central American country once told me that she could trace the evolution of her office to these conferences. In the run-up to each one of them, the government had taken steps to give her office more authority and more resources. Simply put, her government wanted to have something good to report. It is fair to ask whether all these efforts were worth it. Are women any better off after 40 years of crusade for equality between men and women? How well are women doing in the various parts of the world? The answer to these questions depends very much on what kind of progress we're trying to measure and where. The situation of women in economically developed economies is, of course, very different from that of women in poorer regions. Their aspirations and priorities are therefore very different as well. The things that matter most to women of different nationalities depend on their own individual situation and can be heavily influenced by the tradition and beliefs of the society they live in. There are nevertheless a number of basic indicators that can help us assess the situation of women across regions and cultures. Are they able to vote and get elected to public office? Are they treated equally before the law? Do they have access to education and health services? Are they able to earn a living, and are they paid fairly? How well represented are they at the top of business entities? On the political front, the good news is that in nearly all countries now, women have the right to vote, and in practically all of them, they also have the right to run for office. The not-so-good news is that the percentage of women in national parliaments remains very low in most countries. Only one is close to parity, and I bet you will never guess which one. Anyone guess? It's Rwanda. It is followed closely by Sweden, which is often the one country that comes to mind. Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Costa Rica, for their part, approach 40% of women in their national parliament. You will have noted that I have not named Canada yet. Well, it's because we're not anywhere near the top. With 21% of women in the House of Commons, we rank 45th in the world. These numbers in Canada are, of course, much better than a few decades ago. For example, as late as 1980, women accounted for only 5% of the seats in the House of Commons. But we seem to be stuck at around 20% for nearly 10 years now. The number of women with ministerial responsibilities is growing steadily in most parts of the world. Women still tend to get social portfolios like health, education, social services, and there are still very few in areas like finance or defense, although there have been exceptions. In foreign affairs, the situation is not much better. At any one time, you will not find more than 15 or 20 women foreign ministers out of 192 countries members of the United Nations. Canada was a pioneer with Flora MacDonald, who in 1979 became one of the very first female foreign ministers in the world. Only one other woman, Barbara McDougall, has occupied that post since. American foreign policy, for its part, has twice been led by powerful women in recent years. Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State under President Bill Clinton, and now Condoleezza Rice, who holds the same post in the Bush administration. The ranks are even thinner, of course, when we come to the position of head of state or government. But it is interesting to note that examples can be found in all parts of the world. Chile and Argentina have both elected female presidents in recent years, as have Liberia, Finland, and the Philippines, among others. Germany is currently led by a woman, and who knows, maybe Hillary Clinton will become the first woman elected president of the United States. Now that would be something. In some instances, the female leaders came from political dynasties and took the mantle from a relative. This has been particularly the case in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, which have all been led by powerful women from political families, such as Indira Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto. As for us in Canada, we had Kim Campbell for a few months, and it is hard to see when we'll have another woman at the helm, since the parties that are most likely to form the next government are all headed by men. Countries that show the highest percentages of women in active politics reached that level usually because special measures were put in place, either by law or on a voluntary basis, to ensure that political parties presented a higher number of women candidates. The same can be said, incidentally, of the public service. Successive Canadian governments in the 70s and 80s took deliberate steps to increase the number of women in positions of authority. I remember when Joe Clark became foreign minister. One of the first things he told his deputy minister was that he wanted more women to represent Canada as ambassadors. When he received from the bureaucracy the first list of candidates for ambassadorial appointments, he took one look and sent it back with a note, "Not enough women." A revised list was sent up, which elicited the same reaction from the minister. Not enough women. The message registered finally. From then on, the bureaucracy worked a lot harder to find qualified female candidates. The old boys were not happy, of course, but a barrier was broken, and Canada has led the way since then in the number of women it appoints as ambassadors. For the women of that era, and I'm one of them, this policy meant they were given opportunities that might not have come to them otherwise, or might have come much later in their career. They were, of course, under tremendous pressure to perform. Most did extremely well, and they did so in countries as diverse as Sri Lanka, Peru, Indonesia, Jamaica, Pakistan, thus putting to rest the notion that women could not be accepted as well as men in many parts of the world. There are, in fact, very few countries in the world where female diplomats are at a serious disadvantage. Women in Western advanced economies are also winning ground in other areas. They are entering universities in ever-increasing numbers, to the point where women are often the majority in many faculties, and the gender gap is rapidly closing in the more traditionally male domains like engineering. The principle of equal pay for work of equal value is more firmly entrenched than some years ago, and the salary differences are narrowing, albeit very slowly, and not in all sectors of employment. Women are also making their way into the business world as senior executives and board members. The number of women CEO remained very small, however, everywhere in the world. Still, a quick look at the list of the 100 most powerful women in Canada, and I'm not on that list, published, I don't know why I ever made it to this famous Forbes list, because officials of the Secretariat of the United Nations really have no power whatsoever. At best, they have influence, and even at that, not that much. Anyway, back to my text. A quick look at the list of the 100 most powerful women in Canada, published by the Women's Executive Network, shows that outstanding women leaders can be found at the head of both private and public sector institutions. I would not want to leave you with the impression that women in the Western world have nothing to worry about. They are still struggling to be treated as equals and often face more problems than men in making their mark, if only because they still carry the largest share of the burden when it comes to child care and household chores. There are still many glass ceilings to be shattered. Our societies are more comfortable than they once were with women occupying positions of authority, but being a woman can still be an issue. You only have to read the kind of coverage that Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign is receiving. How often do the wrinkles of a male politician make headlines, do you think? There is also a much darker side to the situation of women in our countries, and two issues stand out in particular in my mind. The first one is domestic and sexual violence, which overwhelmingly is directed at women. It is a problem that persists in spite of all the efforts made in the last several decades to make the laws and the police handling of such cases more responsive to the rights of the victims. And the other issue is poverty. In Canada, about 56% of the people living in poverty are women. One of the major reasons for this sad state of affairs is that the vast majority of single-parent families are headed by women, who are therefore more likely to work part-time, often in low-paying jobs, offering no security. These two problems, violence and poverty, afflict women in the developing world to an even greater degree and with devastating consequences. We have all read stories of women routinely beaten by their husband, subjected to genital mutilation, or falling victim to so-called honor crimes. These practices are often deeply ingrained in the local culture. Although international assistance can help, changes must be supported from within. In the case of genital mutilation, for instance, some of the most effective initiatives I have seen involve village elders who have used their traditional influence to persuade their community to abandon the practice. The fate of women in conflict zones deserves special attention. They are the first and most helpless victims of conflict. They are forced to flee their home and are left without means to look after themselves and their children. Worse still, rape is often used as an instrument of war, a means to terrorize and humiliate populations. Countless cases have been documented in the current conflicts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in the Darfur region of the Sudan, for instance. In the past, few perpetrators were ever held accountable for their crimes, and there were no international bodies that could prosecute them. Things are starting to change in that regard. In the last decade, a number of ad hoc war tribunals have been put in place to prosecute crimes committed during the conflicts in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the former Yugoslavia, and now currently in Cambodia. And now, at long last, we have a new permanent institution, the International Criminal Court, which can initiate prosecution in cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are specifically identified as crimes against humanity in the statutes of the court, which came into existence in 2002. And by the way, the president of the tribunal, its first president, is a Canadian, and it's Judge Philippe Kirsch. I said a moment ago that poverty is a feature of life for many women. It is estimated that about 1 billion people in the world live on less than $1 a day. The majority of them are women. The sad reality is that in spite of all internationally agreed goals and commitments, women are still much more likely than men to be poor, malnourished, and illiterate. They usually have less access than men to medical care, property ownership, credit, training, and employment. Rates of enrollment in primary schools offer an example of this disparity. On average, for 100 boys attending primary schools in the developing world, you will find only 92 girls. But in some countries, this ratio will drop to as few as 75 or even 50 girls for every 100 boys. And the gap widens at the secondary and higher levels of education. Maternal mortality also underlines the difficulties women face in the poorer parts of the world. For every 100,000 births, 9 women die in childbirth in the developed world. This number is estimated to be about 800 in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is partly explained by the fact that less than half the deliveries are attended by skilled healthcare personnel in these countries. Where women's status is low, family size tends to be large, which makes it more difficult for families to thrive. Although average family sizes have been going down steadily, it remains quite high in some of the poorest countries, and access to family planning support is lacking for a very high percentage of women in these countries. Women also lag behind men when it comes to employment opportunities, and because of their lower level of education, they are less capable of adjusting to changes in economic patterns of the kind we have observed in the last decade, for instance. In all developing countries, women still earn on average about 22% less than men. They also receive only a very small share of the credit available for small farmers and entrepreneurs. This is why several microcredit programs target women especially. Under these programs, women can receive tiny loans, sometimes no more than $100, to sustain a modest business. One of my first visits abroad as Deputy Secretary General of the UN was to the African country of Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world. I was taken to a small village to visit a microcredit project funded by the UN. The women of that village had formed a small cooperative to produce oil from local seeds. They had used a few dollars they had received from the project to buy extremely primitive equipment. They were able to generate, however, enough revenue not only to repay the loan, but also modestly improve their quality of life and that of their family. I was struck by their enthusiasm for their enterprise, which had given them a measure of security and independence. They were already forming plans to buy a bigger piece of equipment, which would allow them to grow their business. I doubt any of these women had more than a few years of schooling, if any at all. But they were smart and hardworking and were quite capable of improving their lot if given half a chance. To mark the arrival of the new millennium, all countries of the world signed on to a series of targets known as the Millennium Development Goals. The number one goal is to reduce by 50% the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day by 2015. There are also targets to improve access to health and education and clean water, to reduce the incidence of HIV/AIDS, to promote gender equality and empower women. Halfway through the 15-year effort, there are some encouraging signs that some of the goals will be reached in some parts of the developing world. But in many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the goals seem to be out of reach. It does not bode well for the population of these regions, and particularly for the women who, as we've seen a moment ago, are most in need of progress. Why does it matter that women are treated on an equal footing with men? What difference does it make, really? Well, first of all, gender equity is a matter of basic justice. It is profoundly unfair that life chances are determined at birth, that being born a girl automatically confers different and lesser rights and opportunities. The very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted on the 10th of December of 1948 by the General Assembly of the United Nations, says, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." All human beings, not just the half that had the good fortune of being born male. Women's rights are human rights and deserve to be promoted and defended as vigorously as any other human right. If arguments of justice and fairness do not move you, the contribution that women make to the well-being of a society should. It has been amply documented that societies that invest in the education of their women are better off than those that do not. Even a few years of schooling for women will have a positive repercussions on their children. Women who have gone to school are more likely to send their children to school. They will also have healthier children because they will have better understanding of the basic rules of hygiene and nutrition. Studies have shown that child mortality is cut in half when mothers have a secondary education. Restricting economic opportunities for women is also bad economics. Underinvesting in women limits economic growth and slows down progress in poverty reduction. Countries with greater gender equality tend to have lower poverty rates. In very poor societies, women play a crucial role in looking after the day-to-day needs of the family. They are the ones who walk hours every day to fetch potable water and gather the fuel that they need to cook their family's food. Healthier and better educated women bring benefit to the whole society. It is often asked whether women, when they reach positions of authority, act any differently than men. Do female managers manage differently than men? If women had more influence around decision-making tables, would the decision taken be different? Would our societies be any more just, or the world any more peaceful? I've learned to answer this question very cautiously. Some years ago, I was asked in front of an entirely female audience whether the world would be different if there were more women foreign ministers. I made the mistake of beginning my answer by the word no. Well, cries of protest drowned out the rest of my answer, and I was nearly booted out of the room. What I really should have said is this. There is no doubt that increasing the number of women in government does have an influence on the priorities that will be pursued. Issues of direct concern to women, childcare, family planning, health and education, tend to get more attention when there are a greater number of women at the table. Whether their presence at the table has a similar influence on other issues is less evident. To focus on the area I know best, I do not see much evidence that women in foreign policy roles pursue a different agenda from their male counterparts. Women leaders have not been any more pacifist than men, to my knowledge. To every Mother Teresa, there's a Margaret Thatcher, who was once described as the only man at the British cabinet table. The most that can be said at this stage is that there have not been enough women in leadership positions to ascertain whether or not they would pursue a different international agenda if they were present in greater numbers. As to the question of whether women lead any differently than men, there are many studies that show that women do operate a little differently from men when they are in position of authority. There is some evidence to suggest that women are more inclined to seek common ground than to confront, that they are more pragmatic and ready to deal with unpleasant situations up front than their male counterparts, that they are less driven by pride and the urge to win. They are also said to be less resilient under pressure and less confident in their own strengths. And I certainly have observed all these traits in my professional life. But in my experience, many women do not conform to this general description, while many men I know do. The bottom line, for me at least, is that gender is only one of the things that shape a person's attitude and priorities. Family background, personal experience, culture, religion, and many other ingredients get into the mix. Some ardent feminists have suggested that the world would be an infinitely better place if it was run by women. I don't know that I can affirm this. When I argue for gender equity and the empowerment of women, I do not do so because I think women are better beings. I do so because I think it is fair, and I do so because I think it is smart. Any society that does not allow half of its brain power to contribute to its full capacity is selling itself short. It's as simple as that. Let me end this conference by coming back to where I started. I'm a lucky woman. I'm a lucky woman because I had the chance to be born in a society that truly believes in gender equality and strives to achieve it. My personal history is not one of struggle in adversity. Throughout my career, I never felt I was operating in a hostile environment. Perhaps because of my upbringing in a loving family as the eldest of 4 girls, I was never made to doubt my abilities and had the self-confidence to be no one but myself. But I am acutely conscious of the fact that my situation is in many ways privileged. It is privileged if I compare it with the experience of many of my contemporaries who did encounter discrimination in the workplace and suffered from the lack of support afforded women trying to reconcile their roles as professionals and mothers. And my situation is certainly immensely privileged if I compare it with that of women in poorer countries or that of women who have had the misfortune to be born in societies that considers them inferior or subservient to men. In my professional life, I have been in contact with people from all backgrounds, religions, and nationalities. I respect absolutely the right of everyone to be true to their beliefs and their culture. The world would be much poorer if we were all the same in all respects. For women everywhere, I have only one wish: that they have the possibility to decide for themselves how they want to live their life, and that they receive from us, who are economically better off, the help and support that they deserve. I thank you very much for your attention.
So Madame Frochette has agreed to take questions, and I suspect there are a number of questions. We will start with questions.
Hello. I was wondering what you thought of the 20th, our society now, in the fact that women are made to feel like their body image is so important to their overall life. They just had an article in the paper about a young girl in university who was suffering with eating disorders, and that's become a huge problem in this society where body image is so important, and it seems to be a woman's issue, that it's women that have to look perfect. So I wondered what you would say on that.
I certainly am very distressed by this, what appears to be a trend developing in our societies, along with some taboos that are broken that I'm not sure help anyone. I'm thinking of the kind of language that is being used to describe women or relations between men and women. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I reflect my generation, but I worry a little bit that this determined fight of women in an earlier time to develop really equal relations with their male friends and partners is being eroded on the side in the name of something that I'm not sure I understand. But I see manifestations of it in lyrics of song or in colloquial language that is being used, or indeed this obsession with appearance that make me worry for the young women. And I'm not close enough to them to really be able to speak with authority, to verify whether my perceptions are correct, and maybe one day I will have a chance to have that kind of discussion with young women of that generation, because yes, I am a little worried by what I perceive to be a new trend.
Thank you for taking our questions. You mentioned, you itemized the accomplishments of the first wave of feminism. You mentioned some of them in the second wave. I was very involved in those 70s and 80s, the very, very exciting days, and it was great fun. We saw the energy start to drift away during the 90s, and you've itemized many problems that many are still living with. Where's that third wave of feminism? I watch people coming in here this evening, and there's a disproportionate number of those of us with gray hair or bald heads than the 20 and 30-year-olds, and those are the women that I'm waiting to see to catch their energy, get concerned, get angry. Can you address that third wave? Is it coming or not?
Well, certainly, I didn't see it coming internationally. I found the women's movement, the international women's movement, very much in disarray, quite dispersed, quite unsure of what their new frontier was supposed to be. On several occasions, I had contact with representatives from women's movement. And I asked them, what are the one or two issues that you'd like the Secretary General to champion? Is it violence against women or sexual violence? Or tell us that the Secretary General is someone who can run with a cause. But they really were not. They were not able really to rally around certain concerns. And used the opportunity that was in front of them. And in fact, there was a very telling point in our dialogue, is that they were very disappointed that Beijing, 1995, was not followed by another conference 10 years later. And governments did not want to have another conference, because these conferences really set the standards. They set the policy platform. And everybody was convinced that if you went back 10 years later, there wasn't much you could add to the policy platform. That challenge is in implementation, in compliance with these principles that were set. And if you went back 10 years later, in fact, the risk that you were running is that you would see a certain unraveling of it. So governments didn't want to have a governmental conference. But the NGOs were very distressed, because they said, but we need these conferences in order to organize ourselves. And I say, if you need a gathering of government in order for you to find your mission, find your vision, and find your cause, I think you have a serious problem. It should be the other way around. It should be civil society that's pushing government. And I thought it was just an illustration of a drift, as you've said. I think it certainly is true in terms of women's movement nationally and internationally, although I think in some countries you still see pretty vigorous women's organization. But I think it's also a reflection of the way societies operate, which is quite different from when you and I were in university or were young professionals. There seems to be less appetite for protest and for the kind of thing that we enjoyed doing very much. I think it's taking different shapes. I think the internet can provide other avenues, other ways for people to pursue their concerns. But generally speaking, I find that there's less traditional militancy in the way we experienced in the early 70s, where people at the drop of a hat were in the street to demonstrate for this and that. I'm not saying that it was better in our days. I'm saying that to each generation to find its way to pursue its vision, its goals, its priorities, and it will probably not mean a revival of the women's movement as it was invented by our generation.
Good evening.
Oh, you're in the dark, yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry. It was mentioned in your introduction about your involvement with CG, and I was just curious to what extent are you involved with CG, and how do you feel that think tanks just like CG are helping to empower women? And
my involvement with CG is focused on a project that I chair along with a wonderful team of researchers, and it focuses on the so-called nuclear renaissance, the likelihood that we will see many countries, including Canada, going back to nuclear power generation, and in fact many countries that have not until now used nuclear power plants to meet their energy needs, initiating such programs. And my project is designed to assess whether the international arrangements that we have in place to ensure that that nuclear energy is exploited safely, that it doesn't give rise to proliferation of nuclear weapons, that all these arrangements are robust enough to support a significant increase in the in the number of nuclear power plants. We are just at the end of the first year, just starting the second year. Our intention is to publish a report towards the end of next year with concrete recommendations based on our findings. So, and I feel frankly very privileged to have been offered the possibility of pursuing this kind of research, a very purposeful. It's really research with a purpose. Our goal is to put out for public discussion and for the attention of governments and bureaucrats what we think needs to be done to make sure that we have the as good a system of support for this new nuclear age that we seem to be facing. I think CG is an extraordinarily welcome innovation, or it's filling a really important need in Canada for places where you can debate international issues, but to discuss and research international issues for the purpose of contributing to public consideration, policy formulation. We have wonderful research done in many universities, but there's a difference between academic research and a policy-oriented research. And the wonderful thing that CG is doing is really bringing these universes together. It's attracting first-rate academics from various universities, from here and in the Waterloo region, but also from many other institutions around Canada and internationally. But it's also bringing people like me who have a practical experience. We're practitioners, and there aren't too many institutions in Canada that can do it, and therefore I think it fills a very important a gap in the landscape of institutions in Canada. Whether that is I frankly do not view it as an instrument of promotion of women's interest, but I am happy to note that if you go through the list of fellows and research fellows at CG, you will find a very large number of women, and there certainly is no absolutely no problem for women in occupying a big share of this research universe. In that way, I guess it is contributing to preparing women, especially the younger ones who come in research capacities, through their experience with CG. I think they will be better prepared to assume positions of leadership in the future.
Thank you. My question comes out of your asking about your personal experience, and more importantly, what's going on in Kenya right now. You mentioned Darfur in the Sudan. You mentioned the DRC, where it's the conflict is spiraling again, and we see, or we know that there's a disproportionate number of women who are in the refugee camps. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about your experience of working in the field, where the role you see women playing in the rebuilding of these countries, because there is a number of women that are fleeing the conflict, and the men are historically being caused to fight in the conflict. And if you could comment on what's going on in Kenya, that would be great too.
Women are usually, and I made that mistake too in my text, in my conference, of highlighting their role or their situation as victim of conflict. But increasingly, there is a recognition that women are absolutely vital actors in the forging of new societies, of all these reconciliation exercises, and the rebuilding of institutions, and the creation of democratic, not only laws but practices. Women are absolutely fundamental in this process of changing society, so that they do not fall back in a situation where they will resolve their inevitable differences by resorting to arms and violence. While there is a greater recognition, and certainly at the UN, I saw over the 8 years, certainly an increasing understanding of the fact that you have to reach out to women, give them a voice, make sure that they are integrated in all these reconciliation efforts and negotiation exercises, and that new institutions are built where they can play their role. But there's a big gap between the intellectual recognition of a desirable change in the approach and the practice on the ground. And I think the UN is honestly trying to bring in women, and all peacekeeping missions now have personnel whose sole responsibility is to ensure that women in these war-torn societies are brought in and allowed to contribute to the resolution of the endless problems that their societies are facing. It is still very easy to fall back to that more traditional approach, where the traditional players, political players, are the ones at the end that make the deals and set the tone for the future. So my bottom line, my personal experience tells me that we're starting to understand, but we're very far from having really integrated in day-to-day practice the participation of women as full, equal partners in the rebuilding of war-torn societies. In Kenya, I'm in a sense I don't have any privileged information on Kenya. I'm now out of office. I've been out of office for a year and a half, so I always hesitate to pronounce on issues that I don't know any better, and you probably know more than I do. And therefore, the particulars of the situation in Kenya at the moment, I really don't know where, who bears the biggest share of responsibility and what's the way out. But what I think it does underline is the fragility of a lot of improvements that we have observed in many developing countries, in particular in African countries. You know, in the early 90s, there was this great big wave of democratization. And there was real enthusiasm and a real convergence, in a sense, of values internationally towards greater respect for human rights and for democracy. And you saw in Africa in particular many dictators being expelled or losing wars or whatever, and a new generation of leaders, born of democratic processes. But it's now 10 years or almost 15 years in some cases, and a number of factors come into play. I think there's, in some quarters, some disenchantment with democracy that hasn't delivered as much as was hoped for at the time. You also have, as very often is the case, leaders who were very democratic when they had a chance to win the election and become less so when the time comes to step down. And the problems in these countries are so deep. The poverty is so pervasive that people tend to fall back, particularly in societies where you have strong tribal or ethnic identities, to fall back to your own, because the state is too weak to really protect you. The state and your society doesn't produce enough material wealth for everybody to feel confident that they can look after themselves. So when you put all of this in the mix, you find that even in a country like Kenya, that was regarded as one of the solid democracies of Africa, that it doesn't take much to generate negative dynamics. So the question is always then, well, what do Western countries do? What is their share of the responsibility? Are they? And I must say that my experience in the UN has left me perhaps more confused than before. I'm being very candid here. But it has led me to ask myself perhaps more than before, what are the limits of the influence or the positive contribution that we can make, even when we are well-intentioned, whether, even when we do everything according to the best practice. And certainly one of the things I retain from observing the world up close for 8 years is that long-term solutions have to come from inside. It is the people of these countries who have to make their choices. And sometimes they will make choices that we will not think they're the best, but they're their choices. And therefore we will always be confronted with options between imposing long series of conditions for us to provide our assistance, and being therefore very safe in thinking that we will provide assistance only to people who will behave according to our ideal, or accepting that we will be helping people who at times will make decisions that will not conform to our own vision, and it's not an easy choice to make. So 8 years of UN, as I say, led me less sure of my preferences on many of these issues.
Thanks very much for your talk. You may have answered this question in part already, but I was motivated by the first people asked questions to sort of inquire about what are the institutions that we can look to hold the gains that kind of your generation left for women, to reify the status of women. What are the kind of artistic or governmental or the universities? What are those institutions that we can look to and to support to continue to support women in society?
Not evident. I would say primarily, my gut instinct tells me that universities are probably the most crucial reference in that case. I'd like to say families, but families, people have very, very different and varied family experiences, and it will not necessarily come from the family. In some cases, it may come from family, but I think education of learning, institutions of learning like universities and colleges and even high school. I would start, in fact, in high school. And I think there's a very big responsibility for teachers and professors to have a really rich and open dialogue with their students without, at the same time, they are in position of authority. So it's not an easy proposition, but I still think that it is at that age, in that environment, that many of our life choices are made, where we find our models, and our models are, of course, not only our professors, but they're our peers. So the environment itself has to create peer emulation for certain types of behavior or for certain attitudes.
Good evening, and I'd like to thank you first for coming to talk to us. I too feel very lucky to be a woman that's born in this time, in this country, where I never gave a thought to whether I could go on for any education that I wanted, or there were careers that I couldn't have. I think I've also celebrated with every woman that made a breakthrough of these barriers. As a woman, I celebrated. You talked about issues or things that, were people concerned about something. One of the concerns I have, and maybe I'm alone, is that in the empowering of women, one of the things that I'd like to see is a recognition, a dignifying, a raising of the importance of the women that choose to be just mothers. Because I see it as one of the most important jobs that we can do. And even though we've made all these breakthroughs, in some places there was this feeling, what do you do? Well, I'm a mom. No more talk. What else? Somebody else to talk to. But somehow, even at a government level, women at home, there's nothing there. And I just see it as so important. And I don't know where that change would happen.
Coming from a woman who did not have children, I can tell you that the pressure exists exactly in the other way. I didn't have children, and I have, like you, been in situations where I wasn't corresponding to the norm, and it wasn't necessarily always comfortable. My bottom line, as I said, is what is really important is that women feel free to choose the life that they want, and that the society accept that. And if a woman wants to stay at home and have children and look after the children, bravo for her. And if a woman chooses, or where circumstances of life mean that she doesn't have children or doesn't marry, that also should
I'm
be
totally in
perfectly
awe of what you've accomplished.
Well, I think we are in agreement, absolutely. My sense is that we went through a phase where indeed the woman who chose to stay at home, where all the other women were, fighting to get into the labor market and get promotions, that there was a phase where indeed the stay-at-home mom was probably not regarded as well as she should have been. My sense is we've gone beyond that. And it's perhaps because, at long last, there are enough women in the professional world that it's not incumbent on all women to make the point and prove that we're able all the time. I certainly can see that in the Foreign Service, for instance. 30 years ago, women who entered the Foreign Service were loath to step out for a few years to have children because they were in a small minority, and it could literally hurt their career. Not anymore. Now you have 50% of women who enter the Foreign Service who are women, and some will have children, and some will stay out for several years. I think and I'm told in the business sector, it is starting also to evolve, that the system has started to adjust and allow for a much broader range of choices for women. And really, this is what we want.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a computer science, fourth-year computer science student over at the University of Waterloo. And honestly, you would probably be lucky to get more than 2 women in most of my classes. And I know that it's a source of great discontent for a lot of the faculty and administration over at the university. But it would seem that for some reason, women just don't want to enter into the fields of computer science or engineering, just as men don't want to enter into fields of nursing or elementary level teaching. And you mentioned that women should be allowed to choose what they want. But it would seem that as we choose what we want, we seem to be living stuck in these cultural roles that have been assigned down to us from past generations. How do we get unstuck from these gender roles?
Well,
You have 5 minutes to answer that.
it was a very easy answer. Well, just in the field of engineering, I've seen statistics recently that show that, in fact, these numbers are starting to change. There's a moment where suddenly women decide that they will try out their luck in fields where there have been few women, and usually they realize they can do it as well, and that's it. So I'd say just be patient, and I would expect your field to be invaded very soon. That's in jest. That being said, wanting equality does not mean that women and men are the same in every respect, and that there are no differences between the two. And it is quite possible that with all the equality rules in place, that you will find in some fields more women and in other fields more men by choice. I was in the National Defense Department for many years. All the restrictions on women in the military have been removed. And I think the leadership of the armed forces have done a fair job of making it clear to women who are interested that they are welcome. And to my knowledge, by and large, women who are in a very small minority in the armed forces find that they can have a successful career from their point of view, and that they have good rapport with their male colleagues, and that they don't find it's a hostile environment. But they are very few of them. And I would be very surprised if that number increased dramatically over time. And that may reflect preferences and choices that are not just the result of cultural traditions, but reflect something that is deeper in the nature of male and female mental and physical equipment. I have no scientific evidence of that, but I'm not particularly distressed that in some professions you find more men, and in others you find more women. To me, the important thing is that women have the self-confidence to do what they feel like doing, and and the minority of women who want to be in the armed forces, that they feel they can go. And what is important for me is that the legislative framework and the behavior of people is to respect these choices. After that, if for a while longer you don't have too many women in computer sciences, it's On one hand, I find it a little puzzling because I don't see why women would not want to go into computer sciences. But I'm not sure that I would necessarily see that as a sign that our society has not evolved sufficiently, and that I'm not sure that that's a glass ceiling that women should break. Long, convoluted answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Warren.
Before we break for this evening, I would like to highlight a number of women leaders among us this evening. Sitting in the front row, we have Waterloo Mayor Halloran, sorry, I always make that mistake, who is also a mother. We have the chair of the Board of Governors at St. Jerome's University, Dorothy Rederath. She's over here. So we do have a number of leaders among us, and I know that there are a number of mothers among us who are doing amazing work as well. I would like to invite Dr. David Perrin, our president at St. Jerome's University, to come forward and give a formal thank you on behalf of St. Jerome's University.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thanks to all of you this evening for being with us here at St. Jerome's University and our Center for Catholic Experience. It's a delight to see so many of you here in such a great number, and we surely do appreciate your participation in this, I think, very engaging and very rewarding experience for us to share a wide range of thinking on these very challenging issues that face our communities, both within Canada and certainly in this instance this evening globally. It surely is my distinct pleasure to thank you, Madame Prachette, for being with us. You've pointed out to us a fact that some of us, I don't think, quite have got just yet, that half the world's population, roughly half, are women. Us men quite haven't figured that one out. Maybe that's part of the problem. And when we figure that one out, hopefully it will be a big part of the solution. You've reminded us through your own experience and the opportunities that you've had here and abroad that you've witnessed many moments of transformation in people's lives, transformation in structures, government institutions, NGOs. Some of these have been helpful, others perhaps not so much. But what you've underlined for us, regardless of the transformations and the direction that they may be going and taking the rest of us, for me you've underlined a very simple phrase: women belong. We don't need to go any further than that. We need not justify it. We need not rationalize it. We need not find explanations for it. Women belong. Such an imperative, however, to affirm that and to understand it has required the dogged leadership of many visionary women who have lived through the consequences of staking claim to that statement. And you, Madame Frechette, are one such woman, and you grace us with your honor this night. You've reminded us that public discourse has changed. Language has changed. We observe that the inclusiveness of language games includes his and hers, she and he. But linguistic invisibility, or visibility as it may be, does not change the reality behind it. How secure is this place that has been etched out for women within our language games, but not being played out in the reality and the structures of life? Women are still underrepresented in national parliaments, as you say, and the irony being that the decision makers who have the opportunity and the power to change language games into reality keep in place the status quo. A circular situation is invested in us all. This glass ceiling that goes round and round and around, perhaps a glass ball, needs to be broken. You've underlined for us that empowerment of women is the best thing for us all, and we really do need to understand that. Women belong, period. Otherwise, we deprive ourselves, we deprive our children, and we deprive future generations. Justice is behind all of our future together. You've pointed out to us encouraging signs, but there is much more to do. What I've appreciated in your presentation tonight is the marvelously nuanced position that you hold, the pros and the cons, the complexity of the situation, that there are no easy answers, and we're all called upon to respond in ways that we are capable of doing. For this wisdom, I thank you and congratulate you on your achievements.
Just very quickly, on your way out, you will notice that the Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community sells fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea in the foyer. I would like to extend a special thank you to Sister Yvonne Hunter with the Loretto Sisters. She's sitting in the front row next to Dr. Perrin. Thank you again, Sister Yvonne, for a wonderful lecture and a wonderful partnership. I would like to highlight the fact that Chuck Arian with Wordsworth Books is out in the foyer with some books. A number of speakers this year have books at that table. Michael Higgins probably has a few books left over from who knows what. Still trying to sell Merton to us, I think. Stalking the Holy, that whole thing. So pick that up on your way out. We also have a sign-up for the St. Jerome's mailing list and email list. As many of you were aware that we had to cancel our last lecture because of a ice storm in Dallas. So if you think it's sunny and warm here and you think there's going to be a lecture, check your email by noon the day of the lecture. So get on that list. I would like to thank Megan Lasseline and Carol Person, who help run the center. Megan works with me in my office, and Carol is the assistant to the center. I would also like to thank Carol's husband, Ivan, who just basically does everything free of charge. So he's wonderful. Please extend a warm thank you on your way out to those three, Megan, Carol, and Ivan. Thank you to the St. Jerome's IT department for sound that actually worked tonight. Even though we've been having problems, we really do very much appreciate that. I would like to save the last thank you to you, our audience. This center would not be the success it is. We wouldn't have the level of speakers that come and talk with us, challenge us, and in many respects lead us into ideas that we would not otherwise encounter. So as we move forward into the next 25 years, we do need your help. We do need your participation. With that, we do have, I shouldn't do this, Harry, sorry, but we do have envelopes in your chairs in case you do want to donate to help keep things moving around here. Thank you again, and there is no compunction if you don't have the compunction to give, you don't need to give. These are always free lectures. So until next time, I wish you all peace and a safe trip home, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.